What's up, guys? Welcome back to Reps Reels. Today we're going to learn about the water column, baits to use, and how to catch more winter crappie. Now, most people think in the wintertime every fish is just going to shut off and not want to eat. That's not true. Actually, crappie will get going as it gets colder. Here we've got our handy dandy little skinny whiteboard with some scribble on it. And so this is a pond. We're talking about pond crappie right here. And so just imagine this, you have a brush pile. I've never seen a 10-foot brush pile, but imagine it is. So what you're going to do is the colder the water gets, they're just going to move up and down this brush pile. If you have one right out in the middle of your pond, they're just going to move up and down all year round. And the bait is going to ball up and move. So if I take this blue marker will be our bait today. So if you got your bait at 1 foot, your old crappies and bass are going to be living right here under them. And those bait fish are going to try and stay comfortable all year. So they're going to move up and down constantly. And if you're in the South like I am, here in Georgia, it was like 20 degrees one day, and the next day it was 77. So they're moving up and down constantly. You just have to know where they're at. So they could be at 10 feet one day, and the next day at 1 foot. Typically, those crappie are going to stay between the 5 and 10 foot range. That's where most of your fish are going to be, because that water is less affected by the weather. And it's not too dark. They have light. And crappie feed up. If you notice how the eyes and their mouth are, they feed up. They don't feed down like a lot of, times you'll see people jigging on the bottom. Which you can catch crappie like that, but the crappie, you're going to be sitting like this. You're going to have to catch your attention on the fall. You're going to want to take it, and if you're jigging for crappie over this brush pile, you want to put your jig right above them. Just right above them and move it all the way around that brush pile. Because crappie are going to be looking up, looking for stuff to eat. That's why they stay lower than your bait fish. Now, one of my favorite things to fish is a beetle spin. A lot of people fish rooster tails. I don't like that around brush piles just because it snags a bunch. And beetle spins probably snag, half of what rooster tails snag. But it just helps me to drop it down, because the spinner on your beetle spin will spin even as it's falling. So what I'll do is I'll cast way past my brush pile, reel it back right against the surface, like making ripples on the surface, until I get about right here, and I'll just drop it I'll count. If I know that a 1/8 ounce beetle spin with the size spinner I have on, the size crappie slider, falls at 1 foot per second. If I want it to be at 5 feet and I have it right on the surface, I'm going to go 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. Then I'll start reeling. Now, I know that lure is somewhere around this area. It's not live scan or anything. You can't exactly see it. But you have a pretty good idea where it's at. And then what I like to do is reel and stop and then bump it up. And that just gets that spinner making a whole lot of noise. These fish, if they're feeding, which is when you're going to catch your most crappie, is these guys turn on and off like a light switch. Crappie are on, no bites. So once you find them, you just stay on them with that beetle spin, and you just rip it through the water and then let it fall. A lot of times, the ripping, they'll feel it and they'll hear it and then they'll see the flash, and then that's so many senses stimulated right there. They're going to turn and then it's going to fall, and that's when they're going to hit it. That's when you're going to get the most bites. Now, another thing is, as I was talking about the weather changing a bunch, wrong marker. Your bait fish, the size of the schools will also be broken up. Okay, so if you have a whole bunch of if you have 2 big schools right here, well, now as it heats up and the crappie start eating, you might have a couple out here, a little group out here, and notice I'm making them all a little more dispersed. And then you might have a couple dying fish down here. Now, I know this isn't easy to read. I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants and breaking markers. But these fish right here are what they're going to be feeding on. These fish up here that are live and dandy and they're running all over the place. They're going to be fired up after those. But down here is your food. This, if you start throwing into that, you might catch fish. Don't get me wrong. You might catch a couple small crappie. You might catch a monster. Down here is typically where your bigger crappie will stay. And what you want to do is take a fluke. If you find some bigger crappie, if you find small crappie, and you start catching them right here. And then you catch one that's, if you catch them about the size of your hand, and then you catch one a little bit bigger in your hand, I always like to swap to a small fluke with some kind of fish attractant on it. Whether it be some garlic spray, whatever you like to use, and just let it slowly fall. And you just have your line on your finger. And that way you can just feel the slightest little change. Because you're just going to let it fall. And you're going to count in your head. Like if it's 2 seconds to a foot. You know, do the same thing but with 2 seconds. And then once you get about where you think those big fish are, boop, pop it one time, let it fall. Pop, pop. And just change up your little retrieve. Just go really, really slow. I like to throw my Zoom flukes for crappie. I can open this dang box to show you guys. I like to use, for crappie, a lot of times I'll use a 2-gauge round bend straight shank. Well, that's not actually a straight shank, but a round bend at least. A lot of times I'll use a straight shank, but this is not one. Okay, so what this is going to allow you to do is with that round bend, crappie have really, really soft mouths. So they're going to either suck it in or you're going to need the round bend to move around in their lip, because I have ripped the lips off of crappie before. You just got to be real gentle with them and have a hook that has a little bit of play. Just keep tension, keep them down, don't let them come up to the top, because if they get their mouth above, they can get this out. Another thing when fishing for crappie, in ponds especially, they're like bass in ponds. They just school up. I like to think that crappie in big lakes are more like white bass. And then in ponds, they're more like black bass just because of the food options. Bass looking stuff. You want something that looks like bass fry, because that's what they're eating. So a lot of times beetle spins, I'll throw chartreuse with a silver fleck swim bait trailer, you know, crappie slider, to go on the beetle spin, and I'll take it and I'll throw, and like I said, and I'll come across here and I'll pause, let it drop, rip it up, and that is a good way to get a lot of bites. And then once I find my fish, it's about finding crappie. Once you find crappie, you're on crappie. Then I go behind with my fluke. And I have some that you can also use. Trick worms. That's actually shaky head worms. Pull one out of there. These are shaky head worms. You could use them in colder water because they don't wiggle as much. They just have a little, about that much. Well, that's a little bit more than they actually have. But it's just a small worm like that, a little smaller would work. I'd bite it off at about right there, and I'd put it on a real small hook. But trick worms, flukes, shaky head worms with no shaky head. Heck, you could use a shaky head if you wanted to, but I would rather have something that slowly fell and fell kind of flat, and then did that. And then just kind of wiggled, pop, and then falls flat, and then get us that. You want something that's going to just slowly descend on the water column, because your bigger fish will be at the bottom. Because your smaller fish are going to exert more energy to catch these bait fish. And the wounded bait fish, and the ones trying to escape, are going to fall down to these bigger fish that don't want to have to exert as much energy because they're big and fat. That's where you catch big crappie.